So this is a continuation of the chapter on the nervous system, remembering that all behavior is rooted in the nervous system. We talked about the distribution of neurons in the central nervous system. We talked about the microanatomy of neurons. We talked about the basic structure of neurons. We talked about how they're colored by using stains. And we talked about the microphysiology, the action potential. That the membrane opens up, and because of the sudden exchange of ions across the membrane, the electrical potential changes, propagating waves of electricity and exchange of ions across the membrane. We talked about the exchange of neurotransmitters from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic membrane and propagating new action potentials. Several different neurotransmitters, including acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, and the endorphins, as well as anandamides, GABA and glutamine, vasopressin, oxytocin, and NMDA. And this is where we pick up the material for the second of the nervous system tests. As you'll see from the overview, that the nervous system is divided into two divisions: the central nervous system, which includes in brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes the somatic and autonomic divisions. We're going to sort of do these backwards, starting with peripheral first, and spending most of the time in this discussion on the central nervous system. The central nervous system, of course, is divided into the brain and spinal cord. One of the questions on your study sheet, which, by the way, you should always keep handy during these lectures so that you can pick up the material for each question that's on the study sheet. And there's one question that refers to the three major areas of the brain. They include the hindbrain, which is involved in all the vegetative functions, like breathing, heart rate, swallowing, etc. It's the most primitive part of the brain. The midbrain, which is in the center of the brain, it's involved in all the homeostatic functions, like temperature regulation, appetite and thirst, and sex drive. And the most advanced mammalian part of the brain, called the forebrain, which is involved in all the higher mental functions like problem solving, language, etc. The spinal cord, of course, is the second part of the central nervous system, which is involved in the transmission of impulses to and from the brain, and the reflex arc. The peripheral nervous system is where we'll start, though, and it is divided into two major areas: the autonomic division, which includes the fight, flight, or freeze response, and that's further divided into the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. The sympathetic branch allowing for the organism to fight, flight, or freeze, and the parasympathetic branch is involved in rebuilding and restoring the balances within the nervous system. Part of the autonomic system includes the endocrine system, which, if you remember from the earlier lecture, hormones are like neurotransmitters. The major difference is they're secreted by endocrine glands into the bloodstream, and they regulate the internal environment. The somatic division includes both sensory and motor transmission, sensory going from the periphery or afferent, and motor coming from the brain, which is efferent. In the diagram, you can see both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, and how they are really in many ways diametrically opposed. So, in terms of arousal, one can only be either sympathetically or parasympathetically aroused. You can't be, with the exception of sex, you can't be uh, aroused in both divisions at the same time. For a brief overview, I've included two videos you can watch. One of them, the second one on the endocrine system, is an overview of the whole system. The first one, though, the negative feedback loop, basically gives you an idea of how endocrine glands work. Because the brain, the hypothalamus, and the endocrine gland, one of several, is involved in the loop, as levels drop, signals go from the periphery to the brain to the hypothalamus to increase the secretion of hormones. And as the hormones raise, a negative feedback is given to the endocrine gland to stop making production. These are all delicately balanced. Sometimes when an organ like the thyroid gland is either diseased or removed, the individual has to take synthetic hormones to replace those levels. So one can imagine what happens, for example, when an individual takes anabolic steroids. Their levels remain high, and eventually what happens is that the gonads stop making the hormone. So if you need to watch these, you can pause the video here and come back to it. The endocrine glands include, of course, the master gland, the pituitary gland, which secretes growth hormones, producing normal growth, or in some situations, too little growth hormone produces dwarfism, too much hormone produces giantism. It helps regulate water by controlling secretions from the kidneys and also the release of milk during childbirth. The thyroid gland, of course, regulates the metabolic rates in the body. Too much thyroid hormone produces hyperthyroidism. The person looks manic or nervous. Too little thyroid hormone and the person appears sluggish, depressed. So these have to be regulated very carefully. The parathyroids help regulate calcium and potassium in the body, and one can only imagine the implications for action potentials. The adrenal glands are an interesting gland in that they produce many things. Some hormones come from the medulla, and those include some sex hormones. Some come from the cortex, and those include corticotropic hormones. So if a person has an immune system response, which is mediated by the adrenal glands, for example, poison ivy poisoning, they're often given synthetic corticosteroids like prednisone to help reduce inflammation. The problem for the adrenal glands is that they produce both testosterone and estrogen in both men and women. The pancreas, of course, produces insulin and glucagon. Insulin, of course, is involved in transportation of glucose across cell membranes, and glucagon is involved in the storage of glucose in the form of glycogen in the liver and muscles. Most people are more familiar with insulin and diabetes. An individual that has a damaged pancreas and cannot make insulin, typically from childhood, has what's called type 1 diabetes, whereas a person who develops diabetes later in life, in old age, or because of obesity, has what's called type 2 diabetes. In many cases, they become what's called have reduced insulin sensitivities. The gonads, of course, produce testosterone in men and estrogen in women, which are accountable for the secondary sex characteristics. And the last and not least is the pineal gland, which produces melatonin that helps with the regulation of sleep. There is one endocrine gland that's not mentioned in the text and disappears during adulthood, and that's called the thymus gland. It's located in children above their sternum and is involved in the early parts of the immune system. It eventually is absorbed into the body. Although in some cases where people have a thymus gland in adulthood, it can cause all kinds of issues. This shows the distribution of the endocrine glands within the body. The spinal cord is interesting in that it transmits information to and from the brain. Depending on where injuries occur, you can have a loss of function, as indicated on the next slide. So if you imagine the right hand of the slide, the upper part of the slide being toward the back or dorsal, and the vertebra towards the ventral side, you can see the butterfly shape of gray matter within the central part of the spinal cord. The sensory roots or sensory horns are on the back of the spinal cord, and the motor roots are on the anterior portion of the spinal cord, protected by bone and muscle, but still vulnerable. Depending on the level of injury, if it's low enough in the spinal cord, a person may lose partial or complete function of the lower extremities, called paraplegia. If it's higher in the spinal cord, it can involve what we commonly call quadriplegia, but technically is called tetraplegia. If it involves one side of the spinal cord, it can result in a hemiplegia, called Brown-Séquard syndrome. Sometimes it involves the anterior part of the spinal cord, or for that matter, the posterior part of the spinal cord. And depending on the level of impact, it can cause all kinds of maladies. New research shows that microchips implanted in the spinal cord often can replace the function of damaged spinal cord, and this technology is just emerging. This slide shows a reflex arc. The individual is touching a flame. The sensory input goes to the back of the spinal cord, to the sensory horn, hops across the interneuron, and goes immediately back through the motor horn to the muscle to cause a withdrawal response. So this saves valuable milliseconds. The input still goes to the brain, goes up the spinal cord and the afferent fibers, but the delay in time could cause significant damage without this withdrawal reflex. The hindbrain, of course, is the lowest part of the brain. As I mentioned, it is involved in breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, some auditory and visual reflexes, all vegetative functions. One of the main parts of the hindbrain is the medulla oblongata. Within the medulla oblongata is the reticular activating system, which seems to be responsible for activation and arousal. Along with the medulla oblongata is the pons, which is a bulbous area at the base of the brain that seems to be responsible for rapid eye movement. It seems to function as, if you will, a sentry during sleep. The cerebellum, of course, we talked about in the first introduction of the nervous system, is involved in smooth and coordinated body movements like skipping, walking, hopping, etc. Things that, if you will, are done unconsciously. It's also involved in balance and equilibrium. And of course, when a person has a dyspraxia, they often results from damage to the cerebellum. A field sobriety test is actually a test of cerebellar activity. Of course, has many structures, including the limbic system, which controls instinctive complex behaviors, especially ones involving emotion and sexual behavior. It has some interesting structures like the amygdala and septum. The amygdala seems to be, if you will, the on button for rage and aggression. But as everyone knows, because a person gets angry doesn't mean they fly into a rage. The septum is, in a sense, kind of a volume control. So you can be a little angry or homicidally angry because of the septum. The hippocampus, on the other hand, one of the most fascinating structures in the limbic system, is involved in the consolidation of memory. So typically people remember things with heightened emotion. Boring, mundane things are often forgotten. So if you remember the first time you kissed somebody, it brings back memories, even though it may have been insignificant in your later life. It was significant in your earlier life, or for example, the loss of a pet or a family member. Sometimes veterans don't remember traumatic events because the emotion that's tied with the memory is missing. The hypothalamus is the gland that regulates, or part of the brain that regulates the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland, and it signals the pituitary gland to secrete hormones. It's called the hypothalamus because just above it is the thalamus, which is a relay station between the cerebral cortex and the lower areas of the brain. It seems to be more like a switchboard, and when people have integrative problems in the thalamus, they often have bizarre sensory inputs. For instance, feeling something on the skin that's not there, or areas of function on the skin that may be absent or have paresthesias. The basal ganglia is a connection of structures that controls slow body movements like holding a cup. This is the area of the brain that's damaged during Parkinson's disease. They're not really sure why that happens, but the basal ganglia smooths out behavior. One structure that's not listed on the sheet is the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres of the brain. It basically is a white fibrous track that connects the hemispheres. And this diagram illustrates all of those structures. You can see the corpus callosum in white that connects the left and right cerebral cortex. Incidentally, this diagram, or one like it, will be on the test, and it's one that you need to label. So it's important to remember all these structures. So you'll see a different brain perhaps, but with the same lines drawn to the same places. This illustrates the limbic system. You can see the structures of the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the septum. There's one on each side of the brain, one in each cerebral cortex. But before we talk about the forebrain, I'd like to take a few minutes to have you stop the video or the lecture and look at these two videos. One of them is a short one on Phineas Gage, who was a rail worker who had a catastrophic injury on the job back in 1840s. And because of Phineas, we discovered many things, especially about the frontal lobes and about localization and lateralization. And the second video, The Lobotomist, is an assignment that will be on for you to consider submitting for extra credit points. And it's worth 10 points, a written response to a couple questions that will be in an assignment. And it's basically about the surgical procedure that disconnected the frontal lobes or prefrontal cortex from the rest of the brain and what happened during the 1920s and 30s. So it's worth a watch. It's a little bit long, but it's worth your time. Look at the forebrain. It's divided into two hemispheres, a right and left, connected once again by the corpus callosum. Some people with severe epilepsy that is not controlled by medications, uh, a procedure that is often used is called a corpus callosotomy, where they actually surgically disconnect the hemispheres. If the focus of this epilepsy is in one lobe of the brain, then they often have an easier time controlling it if the corpus callosum is disconnected. But from this, they discovered that the right and left hemispheres have different functions. Incidentally, that's what the term lateralization, which is a question on the study sheet, means, that the right and left hemispheres do different things. The right hemisphere is more visual and spatial. The left hemisphere is more analytical and linguistic. But you'd never know that in a normal person without the surgery because of the corpus callosum. Each of those hemispheres is divided into 4 lobes. The frontal lobe is the biggest of the 4. And it is involved in many of what I think of as human activities like personality and consciousness, as opposed to sensory functions in the other 3 lobes. The temporal lobes, which is involved in hearing. It's called the temporal lobe because the very tip of it is right near your temple, on the side of your head, each side of the head. The occipital lobe is completely in the back of the brain, the center of it being around that pointy part on the back of your head called your occiput. It's where your frontalis muscle inserts into. And the parietal lobe, which means saddle in Latin, sits atop the head as if a saddle was sitting on the top of your head. And it's involved in integrating senses together and touch. Neglected to tell you, the occipital lobe is involved in vision. You can see phylogenetically that mammals, the human brain on the right, are far different than reptiles and fish. They have very little cerebral cortex. Most of it is involved in sensory function, so they tend to be very impulsive, reptilian, if you will. Mammals, on the other hand, have the ability to stop themselves. So you might remember me mentioning the limbic system. Well, the limbic system actually, in a way, is sort of like the on button. So if you see something you want, if someone provokes you, or if you touch an injured dog, it might bite you, because its limbic system, in a sense, is out of control. Well, mammals can control themselves, and they primarily do that through the frontal lobes, which is one of the functions of the frontal lobes. And in humans, they have the largest of all the cerebral cortexes of any mammal, and most convolutions and gyri. So you'll notice one of the questions on this study sheet is, what is a sulcus and what is a gyrus? Well, a gyrus is the fold in the brain, and the crease is called a sulcus. And they help to increase the surface area of the brain. So there's more surface area in a small space, kind of like the difference between putting 10 raisins in a box versus 10 grapes. You won't be able to get 10 grapes in the same box because they take up too much volume. So having wrinkles increases the surface to volume ratio. This is the similar to what we talked about or saw in the video on the connectome. It's the layers of cerebral cortex that they were trying to reproduce in the laboratory. One thing that's interesting about the slide is to imagine that this whole thing is about the thickness of 6 business cards stacked on top of each other. So 15 to 20 billion cells all jam-packed with glial cells in this small, thin area. You don't need to memorize all of these, but imagine that each wrinkle and crease, gyrus and sulcus, has a name and does a specific function, which we'll talk about in just a second. By the way, this drawing will be on the test as well, and you'll need to know the structures in the brain. You don't have to know the sulcus or the fissures, but you should know the structures, the corpus callosum, the parietal frontal lobes, occipital lobes, etc. So you'll see a very similar picture with lines drawn to these spots. One of the things that definitions we didn't talk about, we talked about lateralization, but is localization. So on the far left side of the slide, you'll see an area called Broca's area. Paul Broca was a neuroscientist back in the 1890s who discovered that when individuals have damage to those areas of the brain that are the words point to, that they have the inability to produce speech. They understand what you're saying, they just can't talk. This often happens when people have a stroke. So one of the localized functions of Broca's area is producing speech. That's a localized function. If you go to the same spot on the right hemisphere, not the left hemisphere, it has nothing to do with speech. Incidentally, Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe is the counterpart to Broca's area. So in Wernicke's aphasia, they can speak, but they can't understand what the person is saying to them. So one is called Broca's aphasia, which is often called expressive aphasia, and Wernicke's area is called receptive aphasia. So what are the functions of the different lobes? On the test, you're asked to know 3 of these, but you can learn as many of them as you want. One of them is consciousness. That's a very important one that makes us humans. It's the awareness of yourself, your surroundings, and your own mental activities. Here's something to think about. Do dogs have consciousness? Do dogs know their name? Are they aware of their environment when there's other dogs around them, or if something's happening? And do they think about their own mental activities? Well, probably not. But it's hard to argue that they don't have consciousness. If you have a cat or another pet, they seem to have some level of awareness. So the requirement to have consciousness is to have frontal lobes. We'll talk more about consciousness later in a separate chapter because it's a fascinating topic. The frontal lobes help us initiate activities. If you watch the video about Phineas Gage, you realize that he was kind of the poster child for frontal lobe damage. You have problems with judgment, with inhibition of emotional responses. That was one of Phineas's problems. He was very impulsive. You can have expressive aphasia. You can have difficulty assigning meaning to words or associating words with certain things. And of course, the motor homunculus, which is another fascinating topic. We'll get to back to the motor homunculus in just a second. It's called the motor area on this slide. These are basically the speech centers of the brain. Wernicke's and Broca's areas are depicted on there, and you can see how complicated even language can be, involving vision, involving memory thought processes, and movement. So the motor homunculus is depicted on the right side of the slide. And think about it as a topographic map. And think about in your own motor control, which areas of your brain, or which areas of your motor activity require the most fine motor control. Well, it's easily your hands and face. And you'll notice that about 2/3 of the entire motor strip are devoted to the fine motor control of your hands and face. Not so much your knees. You can see a very tiny area. It only flexes and extends. But think about how complex it is to play an instrument, to sew, even to write with a pen. So the motor strip is involved in fine motor control. In the parietal lobe, which we haven't really gotten to yet, but since we're talking about homunculi, is the somatosensory homunculus, which is right behind the motor strip. So if you took the left half of the picture and folded it behind the motor strip, you'd have the same thing on both sides of the brain: motor strip, somatosensory strip. This one is more like the most sensitive parts of the body. It involves the number of receptors on your skin. Again, 2/3 of the motor strip are devoted to your hands and face. If you were to take a probe and touch the motor strip on the left side of the brain, near the thumb, the right thumb would start to twitch. If you touched the nose area on the somatosensory strip, the person would experience a sensation on their nose, even though there's nothing there. So they're both like topographic maps of the body. And by the way, homunculus means little person. So if you look carefully, you can see a little motor person on the right, and a little sensory person on the left. What happens when frontal lobes don't work properly? Well, you get paralysis. You have difficulty doing things in sequence like tying your shoes. Lack of spontaneity or lack of flexibility in thinking. Think about Phineas Gage. Perseveration, that is repeating things over and over again. Inattention. Changes in social behavior. Changes in personality. Difficulty solving problems, which of course requires integrating things together, and of course Broca's aphasia. Often frontal lobe damage causes a cataclysmic changes in the person's personality. Again, think of Phineas Gage. The temporal lobes are in many ways much more simple than the frontal lobes. They're involved in hearing. They're involved in the consolidation of memory, both long and short-term memory. If you can imagine, within running parallel to the body of the temporal lobe is the hippocampus buried within the temporal lobe. It is involved in some visual perceptions, and it's importantly involved in categorizing things. What happens when temporal lobes don't work properly? Well, you get some interesting problems, including difficulty identifying faces. It's called prosopagnosia. Oliver Sacks, a famous neurologist, wrote a book about a man who mistook his wife for an umbrella. He had the most severe case of prosopagnosia because of temporal lobe damage that he'd ever seen. Difficulty understanding spoken words, called Wernicke's aphasia. Think about how consequential this could be, not being able to understand anything people are saying to you. Wernicke's aphasia, by the way, is often happens with a thing called Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome, which is caused by chronic alcoholism. Disturbances in attention, what we see and hear. Difficulty identifying and verbalizing objects, identifying what something is and saying something about it. Loss of short-term memory. Here's an interesting one that can't be done on humans because of ethical considerations, but damaging the temporal lobes produces increases, especially in sexual behavior and in aggressiveness. It's called Cleaver-Bucy syndrome. This has been demonstrated extensively in other primates, not humans. They also think this may be a neurological basis of mania. Difficulty categorizing things, and with the exception of college teachers, persistent talking. Again, a symptom of mania. The occipital lobe is pretty much involved in vision. So imagine two circular areas in the brain, in the back of the brain. The inner circle would be the primary association cortex that involves direct responses to visual stimuli like color and orientation and size and complexity and shading. And the secondary association cortex around it is where you give meaning to what you're seeing. It's also involved in the visual pathways. You'll notice that each eye, each retina has each half is divided into a right and left visual field. They split up, they're reconnected at the optic chiasma, and they go back to each respective hemisphere. So It's a very complex process, vision is. And of course, when there's problems, you have difficulties with depth perception and complex visual fields. But the advantages of splitting vision into two eyes is it gives you depth perception. What happens when occipital lobes don't work well? As I mentioned, you have problems with visual fields, difficulty locating objects in space, difficulty identifying colors, called color agnosia. Incidentally, if you see A in front of a word, it means it's missing. If you see dis in front of the word, like dysnosia, it means that you have difficulty identifying what color it is. In this case, you can't identify any colors. This is not, by the way, the same thing as color blindness. Color blindness happens because the photopigments in the cones don't work properly. This is a brain problem. Visual hallucinations and illusions. Word blindness, difficulty recognizing what a word is. Difficulty with drawn objects. Difficulty identifying movements. And of course, difficulty reading and writing. Lobes is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is involved in all the academic pursuits. So if you know people that have a learning disability, it's often caused by a parietal lobe problem. They include difficulty paying attention, or it's involved in visual attention. We mentioned the somatosensory homunculus. It's involved in goal-directed movements. So if you're playing basketball and you're driving toward the hoop, that is primarily directed by the parietal lobes. Difficulty manipulating objects. If you've ever done a Rubik's Cube, it is extensively involves the parietal lobe. And probably the most important function of the parietal lobe is integrating the senses. So imagine an orchestra without a director. Even though they've maybe played the piece many, many times together, they rely on the director or the orchestra leader to give them tempo and to tell which parts to come in and which to fade out. And if your parietal lobe doesn't work properly, it's as if you don't have any integration. And imagine trying to do schoolwork with disintegrative problems. So the parietal lobe include attending to more than one thing at a time. Multitasking is, most people think they're good at it, but the research shows that most people aren't very good at it. They're just good at switching from one task to the next. Difficulty naming objects, called dysnomia. Difficulty locating words for writing, or for that matter, writing, called dysgraphia. Some people have terrible handwriting because they have problems with their parietal lobe. Difficulty reading, called dyslexia. Dyslexia has nothing to do with your eyes. It has everything to do with your parietal lobe integration. Difficulty drawing objects, constructional dyspraxia. Difficulty distinguishing left from right. That's not the occasional left and right confusion. This is chronic kind of problem. Difficulty with math, a learning disability called dyscalculia. Lack of awareness of body parts. Difficulty visualizing attention. And of course, for us klutzes out there, problems with eye-hand coordination. Incidentally, remedies for parietal lobe problems include practice. Not just practice, but practicing perfectly. So if you want to be better at math and you have problems with fractions, then the way you get better at it is you drill yourself and keep doing it over and over, but doing it properly, not doing it haphazardly. We talked about the hemispheres of the brain. I mentioned earlier that the right and left hemisphere have different functions. The left hemisphere is typically dominant in people because most people are right-handed, and is involved in language, speech, and more of the mathematic functions. The right hemisphere is more the artist. It's involved in emotional expressions, visual and artistic processing. Have you ever heard somebody say, they must be left-brained? Well, then what they're referring to is that they are good at language and math. If someone's artistic, they're probably more right-brained. Most of the time, though, you never see these differences because the corpus callosum works properly. If you want to drill down more into this, you can look at the slide. It gives you some idea of the differences between them. Truth of the matter is most people are pretty balanced. And of course, when you get imbalances, that can lead to learning disabilities. Like, for example, in IQ testing, if left hemisphere tests and right hemisphere tests are typically more than 10 points apart, then you suspect there might be a learning disability. So how do you examine a brain without actually having an exposed brain? Well, you have to use some type of imaging techniques, and they've come a long way. In the 1940s, they used things like the electroencephalogram, which has limited use. It's not as expensive as a PET scan, but it can tell you some things that you can't see with a PET scan, like where an epileptic seizure starts. X-rays have limited use because of their inability to penetrate bone. CAT scans, computerized axial tomography, allow for the investigation of the brain and give you a great two-dimensional picture. They're not nearly as expensive as the remaining techniques. The MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, uses external magnets to provide a three-dimensional picture of the brain by polarizing the hemoglobin in the cells. If you've ever seen an MRI, they give great detail, and a functional MRI does the same thing, but it typically does it during an activity like a mental activity. PET scans involve injecting irradiated glucose into the bloodstream, and as the brain is doing a task, you can see what areas of the brain are active and which aren't. And of course, the more advanced they are, the more expensive they are. Here's an image of an MRI. You can see the cerebellum, the corpus callosum, all the lobes of the brain, the frontal lobes especially. And what you're looking for in this slide is the red areas. And so the irradiated glucose is being in the first, on the upper left side, is going to the occipital lobe. In the second one, it's going to the temporal lobes, or they might be listening to something. The frontal lobes are lighting up in the third one on the right. The memory on the lower one on the left side, you can see the hippocampus lighting up. Might be a visual memory because the occipital lobes are lit up too. And the motor strip on the fifth one is also lit up. So that's a review of the notes. Be sure to review this again as you're working on your test questions. And you can use other resources. I have some used textbooks. You can go to the library and get a used textbook, order one online. If you have specific questions about specific questions for the study sheet, you can always email me. I'm working to try to get Blackboard set up so you can take the test quickly. In the meantime, read through the notes and don't forget the readings for out of the readings book for the next test. It's on the syllabus, and I'll talk to you soon.